My name is Dr. Sean Lordan. I am the host of the PT's PT podcast, and today I've got with me Brandon Parker, who is a certified financial planner and a wealth advisor at Great Point Wealth Advisors. So, Brandon, without further ado, just would love for you to introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Sean. I'm excited to talk through, a little bit of the financial side of things, and we can start with my background. So I've been at Great Point Wealth Advisors for about 3 years now. Prior to that, I was at Fidelity, so most people kind of familiar with the brand, but was there about 7 years. So been in the industry about 10. Went from a company of 60,000 people to 6 at Great Point, and I always like to say I always loved my work. I didn't always love being, just a small cog in a huge machine, right? So I ended up going to a smaller firm where, day to day I'm interacting with clients, and it's pretty obvious to see your direct impact when you're standing in front of somebody. So that's been pretty neat. Honestly, personally, I kind of got into the business because I always had an interest in finances, whether that's, investing, or just kind of, the way I like to think of it is maximizing, the work that you do, right? So for me, it was kind of a natural move where I just kind of kept learning and learning. You end up getting some certifications, and next thing you know, you're standing in front of clients.
Yeah, that's awesome. What is your favorite part of the job?
I think my favorite part really is just, being able to connect with people over a really important part of their life and make a very direct impact. So, we talk through major decisions for people, and some of it is numbers based, but a lot of it is just lifestyle, personal preference, values, right? So those are pretty deep conversations that you can get into with people. And, frankly, finances are still a little, faux pas to talk about in the world openly. So, for me, it's a privilege to be able to kind of dive in with somebody in what's a pretty private part of their lives a lot of times, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? So I think, the secondary piece that I really do like about my job is education. And even if it's just answering quick questions, hey, what's a Roth IRA? What's the meaning of that? Should I get one? I may not be able to tell you, should you get one or not? There's some limitation on advice for non-clients, but what I can do is explain a lot of what it is and some of the trade-offs.
Yeah, that's great. And I just want to be clear, I'm not a certified financial planner. I am not an accountant. So that's why we've got Brandon here today. So excited about that.
Awesome.
So you work with a lot of young professionals, I'm sure the gamut. We were talking offline about this, but Brandon said he works at anywhere from 24 years old to probably 104 years old.
Yeah.
Kind of like we do as PTs. So talk about, what are some of the most common and like highest risk financial mistakes that you see people make early in their careers?
Yeah. I think the most impactful piece of advice for somebody early on is it's never too early to get started. Time is your biggest friend when you're young, especially in finances where interest compounds and compounds and compounds. I think it was Einstein said compounding interest is the most powerful force in the universe. I'm not actually sure if that came from him or not, but it's pretty true. You end up with, if you have 40 years to be saving for retirement, $1 today is worth, exponentially more in the future. So start early is the biggest thing. And even if it's, $10 you're putting into an account a month, if that's all you can afford, that's fine. Building that habit. So the biggest mistake I see is it's way harder to break a bad habit than it is to create a good one to start with. And so I always encourage, younger folks just starting out, even if you have nothing today, start with that regular $10 a month into, whatever account it might be, even if it's just a savings account. Start saving today, start that habit. It's going to pay dividends for you, literally, but figuratively, it's really something that's building your future.
Yeah, and I feel like there's so many different options out there now, Brandon. Like there's, Robinhood, there's Acorn, there's robo-advisors. It's so much easier today than it was 20 years ago even. Like 20 years ago, you really needed somebody in the business to invest money with. And now you can just sign up with, any sort of online robo-advisor or something and have an automatic debit. And, we can kind of get into the details of, where you feel as though as a professional people should invest their money. but I think it's never a better time than now.
Yeah, it's been a great development in the last, let's say 25, 30 years even, where in the past to invest, to buy stock, you had to literally call a stockbroker. You're paying them a commission to talk to them, and then they're probably going to sell you something too, because they're whatever, everybody's seen Wolf of Wall Street, right? That idea of, getting forced something down your throat. Now, free commissions, you can trade on, any number of online platforms, and you can pick anything that's publicly traded. So that's pretty cool, pretty empowering. There's also more information than there ever was before, so it's a lot harder to sort through it. So hopefully can help you a little bit with that, folks out there. But big thing is, I like to try to simplify things as much as you can, and hopefully can leave you with a few tidbits that are actionable today.
Yeah, that's great. Student loans.
Absolutely.
So one of the biggest questions that we get from new hires is, or not even new hires, but PTs that we're interviewing is, hey, do you have a student loan reimbursement program? It seems as though, really everybody coming out of school nowadays, but particularly professionals, PTs, those with graduate degrees, have a considerable amount of student loan debt. How do you advise young professionals to tackle that debt? Be really interested to hear that.
Yeah. Well, one, if there's anybody taking on those loans, study your options ahead of time as much as possible and understand, $100,000 is a huge amount of money to somebody starting out. And it sounds abstract, right? Because it's just numbers on a page. But the downfield, impact is huge. And obviously people just starting out in their careers feel that. You start getting your paycheck in, you realize, okay, it's going towards rent, it's going towards food, insurance, whatever, all the different things. It gets split up, and you're like, man, I don't have that much left over. So not to paint a picture of doom and gloom, because it's not that at all, but the idea of having a plan and having a plan for every dollar is huge, and that's something I'll kind of continue to come back to. Yeah. Even if that plan is, I want to have fun, right? Like that's an okay plan to have too. But being able to allocate to different goals is a big thing. So as far as student loans go, coming back to that, a lot of it depends on interest rate. So this is where some of the details matter. If you're talking a 4 or 5% student loan, that's not that bad. Realistically, you can probably get a little better return in the market in stocks, and in a well-diversified portfolio, we'd probably shoot for 7 or 8%. So that's not that debilitating. You're not getting a ton of interest every year with that. You start to get into some of the higher rates, 6, 7, 8%. Those can be a little bit more debilitating, can really kind of stick with you. And I know there's a lot of options to be able to pay less as you start out, and income-based repayment plans. They can help you in the short term for cash flow, but you really do need a plan longer term to get to a point where you can pay them down. Because an income-based plan, you're most likely paying either all interest or mostly interest on your loans, and you're not actually eating into principal at all. So that would be something to watch for as you get going. Even if you can't afford all of it today, at least think ahead enough where you can start to plan and say, okay, right now I'm just trying to stay afloat, but this is how I'm going to get to a point where I pay it off.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And I think taking into consideration interest rates is huge. Any other kind of advice that you give folks with, especially if they're considering that income-based repayment plan? Like to me, it's one of the scariest things you can do, because you're carrying that principal. You're just paying, so you're never really paying down the principal of the loan. To me, I'd want to see at least a little bit of that principal being paid every month. Yeah. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, generally I agree. I think the biggest thing is you have this tension between cash flow and covering your needs today versus long-term, building wealth, building your future, building retirement, all of that stuff. And so, the two things play off of each other. You can't really, if you don't have the cash flow, there's really not a ton you can do. We'll dig in a little bit more on budgeting, but I think one of the things that I really encourage people as they get started is try to control your fixed costs. And what I mean by that is, instead of buying a brand new car, maybe you buy an older car on a smaller, either no loan, cash, whatever you have, or you live with roommates for a couple of years and you keep those like monthly recurring costs that are hard to change, you try to keep those a little bit low, and it gives you more breathing room on the things that you can change in the short term, right? So, you might have months where it's feeling a little bit tight. If it's all fixed costs, there's really not a lot you can do about it without moving or selling your car, which are big, hard things to do. Versus, if it's just dining out or ordering takeout or something, okay, you can dial that down for a period of time if you need to and say, all right, I'm going to pay a little bit more to my student loans.
Yeah. I think, a lot of it goes back to negotiating that first job too, right? And, I think what I see, especially in the field of PT, Brandon, is, new grads will go veer toward, maybe a field within PT that pays a little bit more just so they can pay off their student loan debt.
Yeah.
For that 40-hour-a-week job, but they don't necessarily love it or see themselves there in the long term. And, obviously as a private practice owner, that worries me a little bit, because if you're, just graduating, you should be excited to do the job.
Yeah.
And you should be able to do really anything within the field of PT and be able to make a nice salary for it.
Yeah.
But that's just not the way insurance companies reimburse. And, and I'm specifically talking about home care versus outpatient versus hospital.
Yeah.
There's probably about 10 to 20% difference between outpatient PT across the state and really the Northeast, and then home care. So there's two ways that I kind of look at it, and that I talk about it with new grads. Is like, if you're really interested in orthopedics, that's great. Like, do that job 40 hours a week, and then take a side gig, do a side job. And, unfortunately today, I feel like if you really want to live and have a high quality of life, living in Massachusetts, it's an expensive state.
It is. No doubt about that.
As a PT, it just kind of makes sense to have, a per diem gig on top of, a regular job.
Yeah. So I was going to ask about that. So is that a pretty common opportunity for PTs graduating? You have your salary job, and then there's ability to do some hourly contract type of work.
Yeah, so we do a couple different ways. We'll have per diem employees that do per patient. They'll come and work on a Friday or Saturday or both days. Or just a couple days a week, and that'll be their kind of side gig. We also have a lot of PTs that are full-time with us, and then they'll do per diem, for home health or for skilled nursing facility, for hospitals.
Okay.
And it kind of it gives them experience, and it also helps them pay off that student loan either a little faster or in general. But allows, and I want to I'm going to press you about sort of a number that equals quality of life in Massachusetts.
Sure.
But I think that matters too. And there's so many things that factor into this, like the work-life harmony and everything, balance, whatever you want to call it. But I think at the end of the day, we'll talk about budgeting. More needs to come in on that balance sheet than what's going out. And that typically means early on in your career, until you've established a skill set and value, that you just have to work more hours if you want to live a higher level of life. Good.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And it's maybe the way to look at it is that's an awesome opportunity. Not everybody coming out of college is going to have a skill set that's that marketable to be able to bill hourly, right? Like, that's a nice add-on to anything that you're earning. So yes, like, you're working more time, and it may, not be the most fun thing to do on a Saturday morning or something. But those are huge opportunities. They're also learning opportunities, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I think about. I was previously a professional golfer, so I think a lot in terms of like, okay, what do I need to do to keep improving my skill set? And I feel that way at work as well. Repetitions is a huge part of that. I don't know how familiar you are with like Malcolm Gladwell's work, and aggregating some of the ideas of like, how do you become a professional? How do you become an expert at something? And the 10,000 hour rule. Yeah. It might even be more hours for PTs, to be honest with you, because there's so many aspects to the job. But getting those hours early in your career, that's going to also be like compounded over the course of your career. And by the time you're 30, if you have 10,000 hours, however many hours under your belt, that's a huge asset too. Yeah,
and I think, so what is that, 5 years, right? About 5 years.
Yeah.
So, I love Malcolm Gladwell's work, and I feel as though, and the advice that I give, to new hires or to younger PTs is, the more bodies you see, it's just, I feel like there's two different levels of PT, or two different types of PTs. There's the PTs who look at being busy as a burden to them, and then it's going to burn them out, and this, that, and the other thing. And I'm talking about normal busy, like 10 to 12 patients a day, whatever.
Yep.
Not, 18, 20, that's banana land. 80, 90 visits a week. That's too much. That's too busy. That is burnout. But like, here our expectation is 60 visits a week, right? And it's about 12 patients a day, which is totally reasonable in an 8-hour day.
Yeah.
And I think of that learning opportunity, Brandon, like when you're seeing, 12 people a day with 12 different conditions, like, and you multiply that by 5,000 hours, right?
Yeah.
So if that's 8 hours and 12 patients, that's a lot of patient contacts. It's an opportunity to get better at the craft.
Totally.
And, or I'm thinking 5,000 hours, think about 10,000 hours,
Yeah.
And then if you can do a little bit more, add 10 hours a week, see 10 more patients on the weekends, that, it compounds over time, just like money in the stock market.
Absolutely.
Budgeting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about budgeting.
Yeah. So budgeting is most people's least favorite topic. So I'll tell you my approach personally, how I approach things. As much as I think about money on a daily basis, because it's my job, I also don't want to be thinking about every single purchase in my life and every thing that I do and be like, counting pennies. And so I try to approach it kind of from a bucketed approach. Yeah. And, I mentioned fixed expenses earlier. So this is really where my philosophy comes in. I try to keep fixed expenses low so that I have flexibility on kind of the variable things. Every month can be different, right? Like I might go on vacation in March, in July, maybe we're going out to dinner more often because it's hot out and I don't want to cook, right? But those things kind of can balance out if you are really responsible and thoughtful about what your basic every month needs are. So that's kind of generally how I approach budgeting. I think, everybody's style is going to be a little bit different. There's no one answer for everybody. Yeah. I will say, just know where your money is going. That is a huge first step. Start that right out of college. You mentioned a couple services early on. Mint, unfortunately, no longer exists, but there are other ones out there.
Any in particular you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, without getting too deep into, product recommendations, but there's a bunch of them. You can do it through, I think Quicken has a version of it that's paid. There's another one called Monarch is, I think another paid one now. But basically just search, you might see account aggregator as kind of a bucket for what these things are called. Also, a lot of credit cards will do it. Yeah. So personally, I put pretty much everything on credit cards because I'd prefer to know and be able to track it over time, right? So that's another way that you can do it. Whatever credit card that you use, kind of use that one exclusively. Hopefully pay it off entirely in a month, but at least you can track where all those dollars are going. So I think that's like step one, know where the money's going. You can't budget it if you don't know. And two, you can't budget it if you can't track it and make sure that you're sticking to it. I would say, the third piece, build in a little flexibility, especially with, again, things like entertainment, food, whatever, like they fluctuate. It's not going to be exactly the same all the time. Eggs might double or triple in cost over a 2-month period. So not to get into that at all.
$12.99 for a 12-pack of eggs,
right. But, there's certain things you can't control. So you have to be able to control the things you can and worry about the things you can control, and then build yourself a little bit of grace so that you're not in trouble when something happens outside of your control.
Yeah, that's good advice. Let's talk about, so the average PT salary coming out of school is around $85,000 a year, between $75,000 and $85,000.
Yep.
So talk to me, let's just say the nets of that are a nice even number of $5,000 a month, right? So you're a brand new PT, you're making $5,000 a month, you're in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
How are you spending that $5,000?
Yeah, it's a great question. Mass, I think I saw, it depends on which ranking you look at, but it's either number 1 or 2 most expensive state in the country. Some of that is, it's a small state, so it's all pretty urban with, some rural areas mixed in, but Hawaii is the other one up there. There's some good reasons why it's expensive. They have to ship everything there.
Yeah.
But housing, especially in Mass, is probably the number one biggest cost for people. That's going to be across the board. There's really no way around it other than, you're coming out of college, you probably are used to living with roommates. Personally, I loved living with roommates when I was younger too. It's just a built-in social, and you learn a lot from your peers, whether they're in the same field or not. and you kind of grow up together in some sense.
Yeah.
So I would say embrace roommates. People might look at it and say I'm, being old school and whatever, but there will come a time in your life. I'm in my 30s now. It gets harder to see your friends. So just embrace it when you're younger.
Yeah.
That's probably the easiest way to bring down your costs. So, let's say I live in Boston. Let's say you're in South Boston where I live. Basic 3-bedroom apartment is probably almost $5,000 a month. So, you're not renting that by yourself. If you go and rent a 1-bedroom, it's probably $28,000 or $2,800 a month, maybe even $3,000. So you're paying that by yourself. Let's say that's $3,000. You kind of can't afford that on a $5,000, salary net. You start splitting that up, it can get a little bit more manageable. Let's say it's a $5,000 a month. Now you're looking at, basically $1,700 a month. Okay. Now we're playing in a range that is a little more manageable. Under 35% or so of your take home is probably a good rule. Other states, you could probably do a lot better than that, but we'll stick with Massachusetts for the time being. Housing is your biggest challenge. It really is. So if you can, find ways to be a little creative. And honestly, I lived in some pretty crappy places when I started out. So it is what it is, and it may not feel awesome, but it's also motivation to keep kind of working hard and, build that career equity so that you can kind of move up the ladder a little bit and control your own destiny a little bit more down the road.
Yeah, and that's a whole conversation that I don't know if we're going to be able to get into today, but that's huge. So I love that we're really kind of focusing in on fixed cost, right? So, adding in that student loan payment, let's say it's, I know they can be over $1,000 a month in a lot of cases. So now you've got a net of $5,000 in income. You got a $1,700, where you're living. Now you got $1,000 in student loans. Let's just say it's a higher, on average, maybe it's $750 or $800, whatever. Let's call it $1,000. So now you're at $2,700. So half of your money out the door, without even having a car, going out to eat, is student loans.
Feeding yourself. All that stuff.
So let's say the student loans are let's say it's $300 a month, just so we have some money to play with. So you got $3,000 left in that income. How are you spending that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think this is where you have to start prioritizing, right? So one of the beauties of living in this country is you can do almost anything. It's you have a lot of freedom, but you can't do everything. So it's important to remember that. You might look on social media and see somebody that looks like they're doing everything. A lot of times, if you pull back the curtain, their life isn't exactly what you think. And believe it or not, I see quite a bit of that with people that might earn a ton of money, but where does it all end up? They don't know. And they're not really paying themselves much, so they're kind of stuck on this treadmill. So I would encourage people, as much as possible, just be thoughtful. If you really enjoy being social and going out to eat, that's okay. Prioritize that as something that's important to you. If you really love traveling, prioritize that as something that's important to you, but also you probably have to trade it off with something else. So, maybe that means you don't own a car, right? If you live in a city, you can get away with that. Public transit and, Ubers here and there, biking, whatever it might be. But know that those things are trade-offs. Especially when you're starting out, you're not going to be setting the world on fire with your salary. 75 or 85,000 is a pretty good salary. You can definitely cover your needs on that. You just have to be thoughtful about where that money does go.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on emergency funds?
Yeah. So emergency fund, especially as you get older, is really important because things do pop up. When you're first starting, it is maybe the biggest challenge is getting kind of to a place where I don't know, let's just throw out a random thing that could happen. Your car breaks down and you have to replace something for $2,000. You probably don't have that in your monthly budget. Let's say you're taking home $5,000. You probably don't have an extra $2,000 just sitting around every month. So that's where the emergency fund comes in. And, it's the same advice I would say to somebody right out of college and, later on in life. Start with something. If you can save $100 a month, just be really disciplined about it. Set an automatic, recurring transfers. I'm a huge fan of that. Take choice out of it. a lot of times you're your own worst enemy. If you have to make too many choices in a day, your quality of choices starts to go down.
Oh, yeah.
So take the choice out of it. Just send it, automatically draft from your paycheck right into your savings account, right into, a brokerage account, whatever it is, and get that habit going. 100 a month doesn't sound like a ton, but it does add up. And, especially if you're investing a little bit, it'll start to compound and grow a little bit faster too.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's great advice. I think the automaticity, creating automatic processes is, and you touched on something really powerful, Brandon, which is take the choice out of it. Right? Like if you have a choice, you're going to make the decision that's going to give you less pain in the short term.
Exactly. You might be tired. You're like, you know what? I don't want to cook tonight. I'm going to order out. That's okay sometimes, right? But if that's every night, all right, you got to figure out a way to just, you have all the ingredients in your fridge or something, and you're like, all right, I bought it already. I'm either going to waste this or I'm going to use it, right? So you try to take those choices out and build in guardrails to keep you where you want to be. And I talk a lot about being intentional with your money, being intentional with your choices, and that's what I mean. It doesn't mean you need to be perfect. It doesn't mean you need to, never splurge and do the thing that you really want to do. But just thinking ahead a little bit and trying to outsmart yourself in a sense, sometimes you can avoid some of those little mistakes that can add up over time.
Yeah, no, 100%. And you touched on something. So, I don't know if we were talking about this, but that $2,000 scenario, right? So your car breaks down and, you first start working, you need your car to get to work, right? So it's not really do I have to, you have to fix it, right? So,
right.
I want to talk about credit scores and that sort of thing in a moment. What are your thoughts around if you don't keeping cash and capital versus using credit? Like, that scenario happens to you. It's your first, month on the job. You're making that salary. Do you just put it on a credit card or do you try to figure out a way to pay cash? And drain your savings?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
If you have the savings, I would say probably put it on the card first, take the points or whatever, and then pay it off entirely. If you don't have the cash, try to figure out where it's going to come from over, a short period of time. So it's okay to put those things, on a credit card right away. Even to this day, I don't carry a ton of cash because I can access it within a couple days. So I'll put it on a card if I really need to, and then I'll come back and pay it off that month. Yeah. When you're really starting out and you don't have investments and savings and other things to pull from, it may be your only choice. This is again where I'll go back to the same word, just be intentional about it and have a plan for how you're going to pay that down as fast as you can. Because being on the wrong side of compounding interest is debilitating. You start getting to a point where you have interest payments building over time. You're going to pay more and more money, and a lot of times it's not even getting to the principal, right? So pay those credit cards off as fast as you can. Anything over 7 or 8% is a high interest rate, and you need to get rid of it as fast as you can. So when we're talking about that big unexpected expense, let's say it's $2,000. If you had maybe $500 or $300 a paycheck extra unaccounted for, try to use it over those next 3-4 paychecks and pay that down as quickly as you can. Again, this is where the flexibility to work, some extra hours comes in. It's like, okay, yeah, this sucks. My car broke down. I got to figure out how to deal with this.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe at work, I pick up an extra 20 hours over the next couple weeks, and that's going to help me, take a chunk out of that so I don't have to pay a ton of interest.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. I think that owning the solution, and what's beautiful about being a PT is that you can literally just pick up a side gig and solve that problem.
Yeah.
So there's two ways to look at it, right? You can be punitive and, not go out to eat or, delay your savings or your investments, which is, it just kills you in the long term.
Yeah.
Or you don't have to have any pain and you can just go work another job for 5 or 10 hours and make more money.
Absolutely. When I was in my 20s, I was working like 3 or 4 different jobs, and I'm not like one of those people that tries to glorify the hustle for the sake of the hustle. It's just, I had different things I was interested in. I wanted to keep building skill sets, and it was also nice to have multiple sources where, again, you have those unexpected things that come up, or you want to take the trip or whatever it is, and it's a little easier to get there if you have more income. So definitely, I don't underestimate how powerful that is, that you have the opportunities to do that as a PT, and within your own field, and you're building career equity. Like that is, that's really pretty powerful. So yeah, I just don't underestimate that as an option.
Yeah, and Brandon, the way that I describe it too is it's sort of like a chapter in your life, right? So just like we're in a different chapter in our lives, or around the same age, we've got kids, and it's just a different, you want to be present more with your family now, right? So like those 50, 60-hour weeks, like, obviously I still do them in different ways, but the capacity to do them as a physical therapist has changed.
Totally.
Right. So I think looking at your 20s, and I don't know, there's like a million different Instagram posts and podcasts around this, but like, those who really use their 20s to become excellent at their craft and grow and just like fail and grow and learn and fail and grow and, really accumulate wealth as much as you can, it just puts you like at a real advantage in your 30s to be able to use your time the way that you want to use your time.
Yeah. That's always been the way that I look at finances. I look at it as, you're buying your freedom in a sense, right? If you can save more today, it's going to give you more flexibility tomorrow, and I was chatting a little bit with our production crew here. It's like, even if you love what you do and you want to do it forever, let's say you hit 70 years old and, physically it's just hard to do it 40 hours a week. You can do it 20 hours a week, right? So you need to, if you can think ahead, you're just going to build yourself way more options down the road. And to your point about, as you get older, a lot of things do get harder. If you have, in your 30s, you're starting to get more responsibilities, whether that's family or whatever, right? Like there's just more things in life that come up. It gets a lot harder to do those flexible hours on weekends or work nights and all that stuff. Take advantage of when you're younger and you have the energy to do it for sure. Yeah. And, even if it's not building wealth in your 20s, build your skill set. So that's personally the way I've always looked at career growth is, all right, is this time spent towards better career capital, towards better career skills that are going to serve me well, even if it's not like hard skills like you might have in PT where, okay, your knowledge base grows. Sometimes it's just understanding how to navigate different situations, and you just need exposure and experience for that.
Yeah, and what you're really talking about is becoming more valuable to the workplace, because what follows value is money.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think we kind of really talked a lot about just if you can create that skill set and that value, add value to your work repertoire and your work skills in your 20s and early 30s. That can make you super, and just continue that sponge kind of mindset.
Yeah,
that's
totally.
huge too. That it's just correlate. People, they'll say, well, how come you're at this point, or it's correlate to the amount of work that you put in early on. And it has nothing to do with how much money you make early on. It's learning, it's asking, having mentors. It's, talking and talks like this and learning from, people who have been there and done that. But really just being a sponge and asking the right questions.
Yeah. And the other thing, so I coached college golf for a little while too. That was one of my side gigs in my 20s. It would be really hard to do now with a son and a wife and disappear for a weekend and a half with, the college golf team. But with the college kids, I always said, I was like, look, your first job is not going to be perfect. I'll take the suspense out of it. There's going to be stuff you don't like. But, as there's value in understanding what you don't like so that you can steer yourself more towards the right direction for you. And also, while you're doing some of those things, you're gaining skills that are going to be transferable to your next role or, whatever. As maybe you find your niche or you find a slightly different niche within the PT world. Okay, now you're building towards that. Even if you started out doing home care and you hated it, okay, what did you learn? You learned what you didn't like. Yeah. How do you get to a place that you do like it? So those are the kind of things that you can think about when you're, just getting started.
That's really good advice. And I think the other piece too is going from college student to professional. I don't care what setting you're in, and you're now working a 9 to 5, and you were taking naps at 2:00 in the afternoon while you're studying for exams. It's just a big shock. It's a shock to the system, and I always talk about it as at like 1 to 3 years, every PT has like this existential crisis. And they're like, is this what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life?
Yeah.
And, no offense to any of the PTs that come on, join us as new grads, and that's tremendous and that's awesome. But I think the PTs that join us at 3 years, 2 to 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, they just have a different appreciation for the culture and what we've built here because they've seen something else and they know like, hey, that wasn't for me. Whether that's a different setting or whether that's a different company, we want to attract folks that, that add to our culture and our vibe here and our, our team and that want to grow. And I think that's a huge, to your exact point, no job is perfect. It's a job,
Totally.
it's a job, right? If you want to do it better, go start your own business, or you have a different idea or you have a way to do it, go do your own thing. Nobody's keeping you from that. But I do feel as though if you really want to learn and grow, go find a job or a clinic or somebody to work for whom you admire and respect, and a team that's that's powerful and has a lot of knowledge. You find that just like you did with 60,000 people, like then you can go to the company of 5 other people and be a specialist, and you get your 10,000 hours in.
Totally. Yeah, I learned from a lot of really smart people at the big firm I started with. But again, I kind of figured out some of the stuff that I really didn't like had to do with being at a big firm, right? You deal with bureaucracy and all that other stuff. For me, that was kind of a deal breaker, but a lot of people do awesome in that environment and it's not a big deal. So personally, that's why I ended up moving to a smaller firm, but that's the kind of stuff that you only learn by doing it. And I will also kind of add, to your point about people just getting started, you're learning to manage yourself as an adult too. So even outside of work, for those first couple of years, you're like, okay, how do I, all of a sudden time is much more valuable. All right, how do I build in the things that I want to do in a day while also working? How do I go to the doctor's office when I'm also working Monday through Friday, right? Like you start to figure these things out. That self-management is pretty important. For you to be able to get good at your job, you also need to figure out how to use your time effectively outside of work. So those are all things that you just you have to go through it to learn it. But yeah, especially as you get started, know that it will get a little bit easier, or at least it'll get more natural as you kind of get into things. So don't get too discouraged if year 1 through 3 as a PT, you're like, wait, am I going to be seeing, 18 patients, whatever, 12 patients a day forever, and that's really a lot. Like I have to mentally prepare for that. At some point that'll start to feel a little bit more natural. I think it was, I don't know if you guys are music fans, but Taylor Swift and George Strait, back when Taylor Swift used to be more country, she was like, hey, how do you feel so natural up there, and how do you look so comfortable up on the stage? And he goes, do it for about 50 years, you'll start to feel real natural. So it's that idea. I mean, it will get easier. You get better at managing yourself. Feels a little bit more normal as you build some of those skills around, supporting skills in addition to your actual work skills. That piece definitely gets easier.
Yeah, and I think, you touched on, the time piece. That's something else that should really be budgeted, right? And so
For sure.
I personally could be better about it, but, what new grads and PTs that are just coming out of school that really have their whole career and lives ahead of them don't realize yet is the scarcity of time.
For sure.
And it truly is your most valuable asset with investing, but just in general, right? And it's really why we work. Like if you're to boil down everything, like
you're trading time for money in a sense, right?
Yeah, you're working for freedom, and it's a luxury to be able to do. Like I come into work every day and I love doing what I do. And I love sitting down. I love learning. I'm generally a curious person, but I also love being a PT. And I think learning how to allocate your time in a way that pushes you forward toward your goals, whether they're investing goals, or let's say this morning I woke up early to go work out because that's important to me. You're a product of your habits.
Totally.
So let's talk about that. So let's talk about investing and retirement planning.
Yeah. So we haven't talked a ton about investing yet. So I'll cover some kind of basic things, but start with the first piece of advice. Start as early as you can. Again, time is your biggest friend when you're getting started. Even if it's, $100 a month, $50 a month, $10 a month, whatever. Building that habit, make it recurring, take your choice out of it. It's, I think, the most powerful thing about a 401k, if you're fortunate enough where your company offers it, it comes out of your paycheck without you ever thinking about it, It never touches your bank account. So it's almost like you didn't even know you did it. Start, whatever it is, start with the company match. If it's 2%, if it's 3%, if they don't match at all, that's okay. Just start with a number that makes sense to you and can fit with your budget, but start. And then as your salary does grow and you pick up side income, that's when you can start to ratchet up savings a little bit. So that would be thing number one. That's really the most important thing.
Can you just talk about the tax advantages to maxing out the 401k?
Yeah. So traditional, there's two different types of retirement accounts we'll use. One is considered traditional. So that comes out of your paycheck pre-tax. So basically what that means is it reduces your taxable income. So think of it this way. If you would owe 20% taxes on, your next earned dollar, basically you're saving 20% of taxes today by contributing to a 401k. So it comes out before they calculate any taxes. The other type is called the Roth. Roths also have an advantage, but you don't get a tax incentive up front, but you'll never pay taxes on growth down the road. So either one can be powerful. The ultimate choice of which is the right one for you is probably a little more complex and we need to go into in a ton of detail here. But start with something in that traditional 401k. It's going to reduce how much you pay in taxes, which is great. And again, it comes out without you thinking about it, which can be really powerful long term.
Yeah. So our company does, I think we do a 4% match in totality, awesome. But the PT has to contribute 5%. So it's, I think we do dollar for dollar up to $3 and then 50 cents up to $4.
Gotcha. So I would encourage everybody starting in that situation, do the 5%. It's part of your total comp. It's part of your salary. Think of it that way. People will say you're leaving money on the table. It's free money. I even think it's higher than that. It's literally part of your pay. So do you want your pay or do you not? You should take it. I would do that even before you pay down student loans, right? Like that is the priority because you're getting basically money you wouldn't get otherwise. So priority one, if you get a 401k match, contribute at least to the point where you're maximizing the match.
Yeah, that's great. Other investment advice?
Yeah, so a lot of times retirement accounts in a 401k will be people's first experience with investments. The most high level, that I could give, and one of the things that's great about retirement accounts in a 401k is they kind of pre-select some funds for you that are kind of broad and pretty well diversified. So basically that just means they own a little bit of everything, which the benefit of that is, maybe the economy in the US slows down, but China's doing well, or, software sector and IT is doing terrible, but banks are doing okay, right? So if you own a little bit of all of them, they kind of balance each other out. One of the easiest ways to do that in a 401k, you'll see a lot of times they're called target date funds. So basically you choose roughly what year you think you might retire in. If you're unsure, just choose a further out in the future year because it'll stay more in stock. But basically those funds, they start with a pretty broad ownership of a little bit of everything between stocks and bonds. Majority will be stocks at the beginning of your career. And then over time, it'll kind of slowly move you more towards bonds, which are a little bit safer and don't fluctuate as much. So that would be the easiest thing you can do. Target date funds are great for that. Really low maintenance. You put money in and you don't have to touch it. So it's well diversified and a pretty good place to start.
Yeah. What are your thoughts like later on for maybe a PT who's been out for a little bit?
Yeah.
And they've got maybe a pretty solid portfolio of income stocks. What are your thoughts on that? When would you start to introduce that?
Yeah. So variety of different stocks. Generally, again, we kind of just want to own a little bit of everything. That's our philosophy at our company. So we tend to be just very broadly diversified. We don't own a lot of individual stocks. It can get complicated if you do. You talk a little bit about income stocks. They pay what's called a dividend. I'm not endorsing any of these companies, but just say like a Verizon or something pays a pretty high dividend. it's an established business. They have, recurring revenue, and they pay some of it back. So you could look at that dividend income as part of your total return on that stock. Maybe Verizon isn't going to go from, I think it's in like the 30s right now, to $500 in price, but it is going to pay you cash out on that. So, that's one approach. I've definitely seen some advisors that will build an entire portfolio of those kind of stocks. So there's different approaches. I'm not going to endorse and say one's the right or wrong, but it does take some research if you want to go down that road.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm speaking for myself. I think so I'm 37 now.
Yeah.
I would just reinvest the dividends.
Totally.
But I think as you get older, maybe older folks look at that as like a real income. Like, hey, do you want to touch on the 4% rule?
Yeah. So 4% rule you might hear regarding retirement. Basically, the idea is you can pull 4% from your portfolio every year without much risk of the principal going down. So for an example, let's say we had $1 million in a portfolio. You retired, you're 65. Let's assume that's your sole source of income. You can basically, if you were invested relatively conservatively and mostly in bonds, let's say your portfolio is producing, I don't know, 40,000 a year in income off of those bonds. You can pull that 40,000 a year every year without depleting your portfolio value. So it's a good rule of thumb to kind of understand where your safety line is. Nothing's ironclad, but in reality, a lot of times you could probably pull even higher than 4% and be okay. But again, that's where you might want to work with somebody and start to think about, what are the different factors that go into this? How much are you spending? How much do you need? But the nice thing, rewinding back to an earlier part of your career, it can give you a general idea of what you might need to shoot for to be able to totally support yourself in retirement. So let's say you want to be really ambitious and retire when you're 50. Somehow you need to get to a point where you can replicate, your income or your expenses rather, with the 4% rule as a pretty good rule of thumb. So you can take that big number and divide it by 25, or you can take your expenses multiplied by 25 to get to your long-term number. So that's one way you can approach it, and it's a good rule, a good general guideline to get you there in a simple way.
What are some other rules that you like?
Yeah, so we were chatting a little bit about this, and I think the number is 272. But basically, if you take any monthly expense. You take a monthly expense, and if you were to invest it rather than spend it, multiply that number by 272, and that's how much it would be worth in 10 years. So, I think we said $100. Let's say it's $100 monthly cost. If you were to take that money and invest it, and you earn about 7% a year, you multiply that by 272, so it'd be worth $27,000 in 10 years. You're saving that every month, you're investing it every month, but that's the power of compounding interest, and that's the power of some of these decisions that seem small today, but actually can add up quite a bit if they become a recurring thing.
And so that's just, is it a recurring, so is it $100? So I guess let's say, let's say my Whoop band is $100 a month,
totally.
Right? So is that including the, all $100 a month payments for that 10 years?
Yep,
okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So think of it as all right, let's say your subscription to whatever. Netflix is more than $10, but I don't know.
But probably all
Peacock,
your TV
maybe?
Subscriptions, if you think about Netflix, Disney Plus, all that, that probably adds up to 100.
Yeah. I think Peacock is $9.99. So let's say you're taking that one. Instead of having Peacock for the next 10 years, you decided to totally not have it, and you put that $10 a month into your investment account. You earn 7%. That would be worth $2,700 in 10 years.
Yeah.
So, that isn't going to change your life, but what if you make that decision 10 times? Okay, now it's $27,000. So you make it 100 times, so these little things, they do add up. And that's where I come back to, just being thoughtful about where your money does go. Start with know where it goes. Second, have a goal for those dollars as they come in.
Yeah, I think that's like, and that's why I gave you the example of you have $5,000, right? And I think, especially anybody who's new to really life.
Yeah.
You know, either your parents helped you when you were younger, or you know, you just didn't really have the choices. You know, you're in college,
Totally.
whatever. You just kind of scrimped and scrounged by, like I did. I had a job that I work on the weekends, and I put it in I used a checking account. I didn't use a credit card.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, when the checking account's less than $100, I guess I'm not going out.
Right.
You know. And, you know, I
Yeah.
think that having that sort of, you have to know where the dollars are, but I would challenge the PTs that are listening to this podcast to look at your last 90 days of income and then use Brandon's tool, use that law. You know, if you can find $500 in there that's wasted that you're spending monthly, multiply that by 272, and that's going to be over $100,000 in 10 years.
Yeah.
Like, invest that $500 into the stock market, or with Brandon, or with
totally.
or with somebody whom you trust, and be worth $100,000 more in 10 years. You know, there's so much power in that. I really like that rule.
Yeah. And, you know, this comes back to the same idea. Starting early, you're just building flexibility for yourself. You know, it's probably easier to save that extra few dollars when you're younger because you just have fewer demands.
Yeah.
You know, you probably don't have dependents yet. You don't have family. You maybe later on you're going to run a business. Okay, now you have even more different demands on your money, your time, all of this stuff. And stress down the road is another reason why people tend to have bad habits. You know, you tend to justify it. So again, starting early with something is huge, and it's like a bedrock habit that can carry you through your whole life.
Yeah, that's great. Let's talk about long-term wealth and business considerations.
Yeah.
So, you know, many PTs, you know, or I'm not sure if many PTs, but I know some PTs do dream of owning their own business someday.
Yeah.
That was definitely me. When do you think that they should start thinking about financial planning for that goal?
Yeah, earlier the better. You might hear people will say this in all walks of life, but the best time to start was, 10 years ago. The next best time is today. The earlier the better. But, you know, as much as anything, I think I'll come back to the principle I touched on earlier is like, all right, control the things you can control, and have a plan moving forward. So let's say you're starting out, you have $100,000 in student debt, you're making, $5,000 net a month. What can you do with that? Those are all tools. You know, what can you do with those things so that, you might not be able to walk out and start your own business on day one. You don't have the career skills, you don't have the wealth, you don't have, the safety net probably. How do you get yourself there? And, step one might be, all right, I'm going to pay down my student loans so that I can take out a loan to start a business, take out a loan to buy a building, to do all of the different things, and not have this huge anvil hanging over my head. So maybe it's you start paying off that student loan a little bit faster than the 10-year time frame that you're given. You basically are trying to build this. You can't take all the risk out of it, and if you want to take all the risk out of it, you probably shouldn't run a business. But control the things you can control. Build a little bit of a safety net so that when when the time is right, you can make that jump and not have to be totally worried about it. I'll give you a quick kind of personal anecdote. I was something similar when I was leaving Fidelity. So Fidelity, I'll be a little transparent here. I made a base salary and a bonus, just like most jobs, and so you have a very structured income. When I moved over to Great Point, it's basically starting from scratch. So I only earn based off of clients that I have. So if you start with 0 clients, you have 0 income. That's a big jump. Clients weren't coming from Fidelity. Fidelity owned those clients, so they're not coming with me. So how do I buffer myself for a year or two where it's going to be a struggle, right? And building my business and building my brand. So that was something I thought about for a few years before I actually kind of made the leap. And I basically was like, all right, I'm not going to touch my bonus. That's going straight into savings and investing, both for buying a house at one point and then also for that time when I'm like, all right, I've had enough of the big company. I've had enough of this, and I'm ready to go off on my own. So I thought about that, 5-6 years in advance. Not that I knew exactly what I was going to do, but I knew that I didn't want to be there long term. So that was something I started to think about ahead of time. So maybe, you know, in the case of a PT right out of college, you're working those extra few hours on the weekend. Take that money and put it all towards, you know, some goal, whether it's buy a house, maybe it's buy a house for your mom, you know, I don't know, buy an engagement ring, or, you know, start your own business. Those extra dollars, that extra income, if you can live off of less somehow, then that's all going towards your goal. And that's a pretty strong position to come from. And it's going to get so much easier to take that leap when you're ready.
Yeah. And I think what you're really talking about is de-risking that investment in that time, you know. And
absolutely,
I think one of the challenges is the liquidity events that hit you in your 20s and 30s. Like, you have to buy an engagement ring.
Yeah.
Then you got to have a wedding.
Yeah.
Then you got to buy a house, and then you're going to have kids.
Mm-hmm.
So like, it's so hard to get ahead if you're not willing to be a little bit vulnerable in your 20s and get that extra job or 2 or 4 or 5 like I had. And to your exact point, like, I'm not, you know, a huge proponent of like the burnout culture or any of that stuff, but like, you have to make your own choice, you know, and there's plenty of choices in the world, and you're going to give things up, and you know, you may not have, you just can't simply have everything. It's just, it's not a realistic thing. And and I think another important point to your exact point is you prepared for the eventuality that you aren't going to have income for a year or 2. And that's what I went through. Is, you know, I didn't pay myself anything for probably 2 years when I first started Concierge. And I tell anybody who's willing to, you know, listen, you know, be prepared. You need to have at least a year or 2 salary in the bank because you need to invest in the business. You cannot just pull everything out of the business the first couple of years. Otherwise, it's never going to grow, and nobody's going to know who you are.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah. It's there's no one way to do it, but yeah, as much as you can de-risk from a personal standpoint, you know, as you alluded to, those liquidity events, you know, sometimes you just make unconventional choices, right? Like, you know, if you only ever follow conventional wisdom, you'll be pretty conventional. You know, maybe you elope. I don't know. You make these decisions that can make a big impact down the road. You know, no one of those things, like buying a huge wedding ring, you know, probably can't avoid the cost of having a kid if you want them to have a decent quality of life. But
maybe,
you know,
maybe not, depending on your spouse.
But you know, with the wedding stuff, like, you can make different choices there, and maybe you don't own a car, maybe you own a 2008, you know, Honda Civic that has 200,000 miles on it, but it runs okay. You have no payments on it, right? So you can make some of these choices. You don't have to necessarily follow the pathway of, you know, buy a new car when you first start out of college, you know, buy the biggest house that you can afford. Sometimes make these little decisions earlier builds you flexibility, and it's going to let you kind of springboard into something else. It allows you to take some risk, right? If you can be conservative with, you know, your personal life, your personal expenses, all of a sudden it's not as big of a risk to take a leap and become a business owner and start your own firm. I'm sure you would be the first to say how rewarding it can be. You know, if you're a parent or you have a pet or whatever, it's like there's something different when you've worked hard on that thing. It becomes your baby. It becomes, you know, a part of you in a sense. And that's pretty cool. I mean, you could probably speak more to it than I can, but I admire the people that take those jumps and build something, because it shows just a lot of forethought and a lot of, you know, willingness to try something, even though it's not even close to guaranteed to succeed.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's so funny. You know, you put together a business plan and all these pro formas, and I remember going, you know, meeting with my original mentor, Bill DiBenedetto, and I had all these pro formas of like, hey, this is how it's going to look in the next 24 months. And he's like, yeah, that's all great. And I was like, so what if this doesn't happen? And he's like, Sean, he's like, you just have to have faith. You know, he's like, you just got to pray and have faith and do everything you possibly can to make sure that it happens. You know, and I think anything is possible. You just need to think about what success looks like and be willing to put those action steps in daily, like setting the recurring, you know, investment stream, you know, making sure that you're getting that 401k taken out of the account every month. Like, those are no-brainer things, but you know, starting your own business, and there really is no perfect time, exactly what you're alluding to, but you know, in my personal story, I probably started a little sooner than I was ready. I was probably relationally ready for. We had a lot of challenges with, because I had never done the job of clinic director before, and so I had to learn that on the go, and that was a really tough learning curve. Managing people. It's a different job than being a good physical therapist.
Totally.
Just like being a CEO is a different job than being a director.
Yep.
And I'm still learning this job, and it's exciting, and I enjoy it. But I think as we kind of close here and talk about what success looks like, I'd love for you to share something, a financial mistake that you made in your 20s that you totally regret now.
Yeah. Fortunately there wasn't anything that was irreversible. There was a few things that I did. Some things like as simple as I pulled money out of a Roth IRA. I'd done a great job saving. I didn't have that much money. I was just starting. I was coaching golf. I'm all right, let's see if I can get some money in there, and did. And within 2 years I'd pulled it out, and most of the time, so Roth, you don't necessarily owe penalties on what you've contributed. So I had some flexibility with that, but that money was tax free forever. And now I pulled it back out and spent it. Yeah. So that was that one, I'm kind of kicking myself.
Did you spend it on anything good, or?
I think it was on car repair. So it wasn't even anything good. Yeah. I think probably the other one was, my first apartment in Boston was probably a little too rich for my blood.
Where was it?
I made it work. It was in the Seaport.
Yeah. Which building?
I did have a roommate. It's in Waterside Place. So
yeah. So I was in Park Lane.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
So I know right there. It's right across the street.
Oh yeah.
And it's not just the apartment. It's also that you live near all these restaurants.
Del
parking.
Frisco's. Yeah.
Oh my God. I paid so much in parking tickets too. That's a different story entirely.
Yeah.
But honestly, I just built it into my budget. I knew I was going to get them, so it's all right. Let's just say I'm paying $150 a month in parking tickets. We'll just budget it in there. So yeah, that was pretty fun, but it was probably more than I needed at that time. Fortunately, worked hard enough where my income started growing, and it got comfortable after a couple of years. But it was a bit of a stretch early on.
It's funny, Brandon. One thing that I see is once you start to surround yourself with people, that are of like mind and sort of, I really am a huge fan of that. You are the product of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. One thing that I found in the Seaport is that, we never really had an issue. We also had dual income. I lived with Brooke while we were there, affording things. And I guess we just worked, we just took different jobs, and it was just kind of the expectation. It's just kind of interesting. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. I definitely think that's true. And I would say in personal finance, it can be a quicksand thing, right? So if you're, let's say you are around people that are earning really well, I don't know, doctors, lawyers, professionals in their own field, and PTs, as you kind of move up the ladder and run your own business, be around people that are earning really well. One, you don't really know behind closed doors what they're saving, if they're saving. Yeah. Sometimes people are overspending or kind of overstating how much they actually make, buying cars they probably shouldn't buy just to look better. So it can be really easy to get sucked into that. You might hear the term lifestyle inflation. I think that's a huge thing. You look at your peers and you try to compare yourself. I think I forget who said it, but it's comparison is the enemy of happiness, because everybody's running their own race. Some people maybe get off to a fast start. Some people maybe get off to a slow start, but they have a really good idea of where they're going and they're on a good path to get there. You just don't know, when you're sitting and watching somebody on social media, or, even friends sometimes. It can be easy to just copy what they're doing, or kind of just follow along, even if it doesn't make fully sense for you. So that's where I do encourage people to have your values. I'm not a car person. I don't care at all what I drive. If it gets me A to B, I drove a Honda Fit. My friends always called it a go-kart. Drove it for 10 years. Yeah. Basically was a go-kart, but it was also just the most practical car ever. And I lived in the city, so it was easy to park, all that stuff. I do like to travel. So instead of having a car that I have a, $300, $400, $500 monthly payment, I paid for insurance only. And that $300 or $400, $500 goes towards, going on nice trips to Europe or go to Japan or whatever it is. So for me, that was just a value decision. that's going to be different for everybody, but have those core values that you care about, prioritize those things.
Yeah, that's great. No, I think there's a lot of takeaways in this for our listeners. I guess if you were to leave the audience with one more piece of advice, Brandon, what would that be?
Especially with finances, don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Nobody starts with knowledge of this stuff. There is more information than ever out there, especially now that AI is coming into the mix and generative AI. By the way, it's far from perfect, and you get a lot of very imperfect answers on finances, so always double check it. But there's just more information than ever out there, but there is still stigma talking about a lot of this stuff. And so, ask friends what they're doing. Doesn't mean it's gospel, but just ask, people that you trust and people that you admire, how they approach certain things. Ask questions about, hey, what is an index fund? What is an ETF? What are those things? If you're curious, you have a little bit of time to learn, you're gonna, it's gonna pay off down the road. And, frankly, I always say too, with our business, to realistically do like an awesome job managing your own money, I think you need time, you need interest, and you need the ability. You need time to get to the ability and be able to do the studying and learn yourself. And you do need the interest, because otherwise it's just gonna be really dry in one ear out the other. As you get older, or, even as you start out, if you have a lack of one or even two of those things, that's where you probably does make sense to look to somebody for help. So a lot of times, somebody like yourself, Sean, you're running your own business, time is going to be a huge shortcoming for you, right? Yeah. You just have a lot of demands on your time. So that's where you start saying, okay, maybe I outsource, my investment management, because I can't afford the time to research all the different stocks to buy my dividend portfolio. Same thing early on, you maybe just say, hey, I hate this. I have zero interest. I'd rather learn more about my craft and, being better as a PT. It doesn't mean you need to pay somebody, $1 million a year to do it, but there are different ways that you can get like hourly help, or, again, it might just be somebody that you trust in your family or, extended friend group that's helpful, and simplify things as much as you can. So that would be my advice. Know your own limitations and know your interests, honestly. If you're not interested, and it doesn't mean ignore it, it means find help.
Yeah. Now, if somebody wanted to work with you, a new grad PT, or anybody listening to this podcast, how do they work with you?
Yeah, so our podcast is a great place to start. So all educational content, cover a lot of different topics, from buying a house to getting started investing in your retirement plan, all the way to figuring out what you need for retirement, and some more complex topics that you might hit down the road. So the podcast is called Great Points. You can find it pretty much anywhere you watch podcasts or listen to podcasts, Apple, Spotify, whatever it might be. I'm on it semi-regularly, usually once every month or two, and then my partner Matt Schroeder runs it for the rest of the time. So that's a great place to start. Otherwise, you can find us. We're called Great Point Wealth Advisors. Website's greatpointwealth.com. Find my email, my bio, all that stuff there. My goal always, I'll meet with just about anybody, even if it's not going to be a great fit. I always want to leave somebody with a few action items that are going to put them in a better shape, even if we never work together. So that's my goal. That's kind of the way that I match my values in this, which is I ultimately do want to help people, even if it's not a perfect fit to work with us. Yeah,
I think that's great. So if anybody listening has any sort of financial questions or in need of advice, I would highly recommend reaching out to Brandon. I imagine the consultation is free. And
always free. Our first couple meetings, I usually do a quick phone call, kind of see what's important to you, what you want to talk through in more detail, and then we'll do a follow-up a little bit deeper if if you want to share some financial stuff and all that stuff, we can get into it in more detail. But again, regardless, even if we talk 10 minutes, I can probably give you a couple steps that are going to be helpful for you.
That's awesome. Well, thanks again for coming today, Brandon. Really appreciate your time, and it's been fun.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Sean.
Awesome.